So that's how we can save an event. We'll also need a function to get all events, for example. And that will not be a method because we don't call this on an existing event. Instead, the idea behind this function is to call it to get all available events. So we won't have any event yet on which we could call it. Therefore, it's a normal function, not a method. And it should start with an uppercase character so that it can be used from outside this package. And then here, I simply want to return events. So this events slice. So the return value type therefore is event slice, like this. So very simple functions here. They will get more complex later, but for the moment they're pretty straightforward. And now we can use these functions and this struct, therefore, in the end, in the main.go file for our different handlers. For example, here, when we get the events, we can now use our models package here, for which we of course must import it from our own path and then /models. And then there call getAllEvents. And as a result, we'll get back those events that are managed in that separate file. And we can then send back those events by simply passing events as a value to context.json. So this slice of events. And as mentioned, this data will then automatically be transformed to JSON by the Gin package. But now we can also register a second endpoint here, which handles incoming post requests, let's say. And let's also say post requests to /events. So the same path as before, but a different HTTP verb, a different HTTP method. And therefore we also need a different function that should be executed. And that could be called createEvent. Now we'll also get this Gin context there. We will always get that when we use a function as a endpoint handler function, which is what I'll do here. createEvent is the function that's used as a handler for those post requests. And now inside of createEvent, we will need to get some data out of that incoming request. Because the expectation is that if we receive a post request, which is sent by the client in order to create a new event, if we get such a request, it should carry some data in its request body. And we want to get hold of that data here inside of createEvent so that we can create and store a new event. And thankfully, when using Gin, extracting incoming request data is pretty simple and straightforward. You can simply create an event with that event type, and then use this context and call the shouldBindJSON function. And this function works a little bit like the scan function from the FMT package did. You pass a pointer to the variable that should be populated with data to the shouldBindJSON function here. So a pointer to the event variable is passed to shouldBindJSON. And internally, Gin will then take a look at the incoming request body and store the data from that body in that variable. Now, of course, for that to work, you must make sure that your clients send requests that have a body that has this structure. Because that is the struct that will be populated here, because we're passing a variable of that type to shouldBindJSON. So we must make sure that we get requests that send this data with this shape and these names here in their request body. But if we do that, everything will work. Though it's definitely not unrealistic that you probably don't get all the data from this incoming request, because it's on the server where we know how much events we already have and so on. That's why by default, Gin is pretty forgiving, and if some field is missing in that incoming request, if we, for example, don't have an ID field, it will not complain. It will simply set this to its null value, to 0, for example. However, if we have some fields in that struct where we know that they should be part of the request and where we want to generate an error if they're missing, we can enforce that with help of struct tags. You learned about struct tags earlier in the course. We used them to control how data gets formatted as JSON. You can also use them with the Gin package, because that package also looks for such struct tags, for example, when calling shouldBindJSON. Because we can add the binding struct tag here and set this to required on all the fields that should be required. So for example, name, description, location, and date time. And now we would generate an error if we would receive a request that's missing one of these 4 pieces of data. But it is fine for the request to not contain any information about the ID or user ID, for example. And that's another advantage of using a package like Gin. It adds extra features like this, which we can implement without much effort. So therefore, with that, we're trying to populate this event with the incoming request data. And we might get an error if that fails, if some data is missing, for example. So we should look for such an error and, of course, also handle it. And if we have an error, I want to use that context to send back a response where I tell the client that something went wrong, which we can do with the HTTP package. And then, for example, we could send a bad request error to indicate that something was wrong with the request that was sent. This is the status code 400 that's being sent. And then I again use this h type alias Gin provides to quickly create such a map where we can set a message that could not parse request data or something like this. So that's how we can handle this error. If we make it past this if check, we know that Gin was able to parse the request data and populate this event. Then we just also might want to add a server generated ID. At the moment, I'll use a dummy value, but that will change later once we use a database. And we could also add a user ID here. Again, at the moment, just a dummy value. And we should then also send back a response if everything worked. So we should also use context JSON here to send back a success response. The status created response can, for example, be used, which is status code 201, which indicates that we successfully created a new resource here on the server. And then again, I'll create such a map where I set a message key and say event created. And then we can also send back that event that was created. So set a key of event and send back that event struct that we populated on the server. Now, one other thing we should do here is in that if check, if things went wrong, we should return after sending this error response. Otherwise, this code here would execute even though we had an error, and that's not what we want. But with that, we now created our second request handler function. We already registered it, and therefore now we can test it. But how do we test such a post request? The GET request was simple. You could simply open the page in the browser. But how can we test such a post request now?